Hello, everyone. We are the Good Doctors. I'm Dr. Kristen.
I'm Dr. Erin.
Welcome back to our coverage of the podcast And Nothing Less, which is talking about the actual history of the ratification of the 19th Amendment and the fight for women's suffrage. We say actual because even just 2 episodes in, what we have learned is that we learned nothing.
We learned
nothing. So some of it is, I think we both kind of knew some of the fragments of these things, but to have them laid out so clearly and systematically is, I'd never experienced this kind of concentrated knowledge really about suffrage. So overall, what this particular episode talks about is the early movement, is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, is Lucretia Mott, is Lucy Stone, is kind of all of that, the late 1800s, and what that looked like. They open up with, I think, Retta saying and the women's suffrage movement started in 1848 in Seneca Falls.
Yeah.
The historian goes in and goes, no, that's not true.
Yeah.
And so we learned things like women had the right to vote in some colonies.
As long as they owned property, yeah. That a lot of early ideas of women's rights came from various Native and Indigenous groups, including the Haudenosaunee people or the Iroquois Confederacy. Cool.
Would have loved to know that. And then what we really want to get into thematically is the idea that they presented, which is so incredibly true, that the reason that we remember suffrage this way is because it was decided we were going to.
Yeah. Because Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton decided that the movement, particularly their perspective of the movement, needed a mythology.
And they explain it really carefully in a certain way, and I think we'll see this with some other movements. They were losing, after Reconstruction and after abolition, there was not a lot positive happening for women's suffrage for any number of reasons, and they needed a positive boost. And so they went back and rewrote history instead of projecting a hope into the future. And we see this over and over and over again with political campaigns. And but I think we know it with political campaigns, and we pretend that history doesn't do that. But if history is written by the winners, it's also written by the literate rich people. And that is a lot of what happened with Anthony and Stanton, who were complicated women because they were human beings.
Yeah.
And there are no saints in this conversation because there are no saints on earth. And we can both say that those women did incredible things for the cause of women's legal rights in this country, and that they were incredibly racist.
Yeah.
At the exact same time, those two things don't counteract each other. They need to be held in tension.
Yeah. And I think for me, that was one of the more powerful parts of this episode. And we talked back and forth on Slack about it after we had both listened to it. It just amazed at the amount of information they were able to pack into 30 minutes of stuff that we didn't know, that undid basically 10 years of US history around this period from when we were in our adolescence. But for me, understanding is not condoning is one of the mottos that we have in our personal research and our public research for Abbey Research, and understanding these women as full, complete, complicated human beings who were living in the context of their times. It's so easy for us to ascribe our perspectives on back in history onto these people and say, oh, well, they should have thought this, and they shouldn't have been racist because racism is wrong. Yes, racism is wrong, but it was also and is also still so deeply embedded in the cultural memory of our country, and was one of the reasons it was founded. Is one of the foundational ideas of our country was based in racist ideas. So to look back at these women and say they shouldn't have thought that defeats the purpose of understanding kind of where we've come from, so we can see where we've gone. But yeah, I thought for me that was, a powerful thing to be said, because as a historian, I know the problems that come from the teaching of history, that it's very problematic. It's riddled with bias, but we don't teach it that way until you get to a certain level. I remember I was in my undergraduate doing my senior honors thesis when I wrote my thesis on the bias of history. And that was like a new idea to me at 25, So we don't teach people that history. We often say it's written by the winners, but we don't extrapolate. Like, what does that mean?
Means. Yeah.
Who gets left out? Why are we telling this story the way we are telling the story? Who are we prioritizing? What narratives are we prioritizing? What image of our country are we trying to project onto these events? And so much of that happens in every historical movement, in every period. And it certainly happened during the women's movement in the 19th and in early 20th century.
And some of that is in how we talk about facts. So there are facts. There was the first acknowledged national gathering of women to talk about political rights was in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848.
Yeah.
So I just added some words in there that show my bias, though. Yeah. Like, it is factually true that a gathering of women happened in Seneca Falls. I know now from all of this other history that it was not the very first gathering of women.
It was the first convention.
It was the first convention. It was the first one we talk about. It was the first written down, like all of those kind of things. In the same way that we can say the South, the Confederacy lost the Civil War. After living in former Confederate states, I can tell you that's frequently not how that's talked about.
Yeah.
Like, factually, we're saying the same thing, but the language we use shows our bias. And so I play a lot in my own writing and research with the idea of truth, and the idea of memory, because I talk a lot about religion and I talk a lot about faith, and those things are very movable emotionally. And we also keep learning about memory, that, there is no set, the human brain takes a picture, and when you remember a memory, you're remembering the picture, not the event. And then as you keep remembering that picture, it's like Xeroxing a Xerox, and it just keeps going out. And so as we talk about these things and emotions, the human brain is really elastic. And so in this particular instance, you and I talked about it. The phrase the podcast used was that Lucy Stone is not remembered because she did not attend to the politics of memory.
Mm-hmm. Shout out to Lisa Tetro, who's a historian at Carnegie Mellon here in Pittsburgh. Whoop, whoop, and a badass.
Yes. So the politics of memory are the things like the propaganda campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
They are Stanton and Anthony rewriting the suffrage movement. They are only certain groups of people in charge of what's shown at museums. They are people who are in charge of writing our textbooks. So it's like, that's all. And if you don't make yourself known, I guess, like if you are not the loudest voice also writing down, like it's very, I like the use of the word politics because it's complicated.
Yeah. And it's fascinating to me that, and Lisa brought this in a little bit in the podcast as well, kind of the gendering of it, of history, in a way that we don't tend to think about women. I mean, it's inherently biased and sexist that we don't inherently think of women as political actors in the same sense that we think of men inherently as political actors. And so it goes against our kind of cultural nature to think of women as politically motivated, calculating, historical.
If we're manipulative, it's with our sexuality. It's not ever with our brains.
It's not ever with our brains, exactly. And so and the knock-on effect of the successful campaign of Anthony and Stanton to rewrite the narrative of suffrage is that we have put them up on literal and figurative pedestals. And so looking back on that, it's even harder to take them down off of that, or to recognize that they knew what they were doing. A lot of times with women too in history, we take away their agency. And so, Mother Teresa is kind of one of those people that, like, because we've given her this like sainthood, she was just a good person. We've taken some of her agency in that process away.
Which is really, she's really fascinating, because when I went to her house in Calcutta, it was really interesting to read her colleagues' memories of her. And then I have some real problems with the way that she set up her organization.
Yeah, and I mean, go ahead.
Which, like, when I say that to people, I'm like, actually, I don't really like the Sisters of Mercy and how they work in Calcutta. People are like, but it was Mother Teresa.
But it was Mother Teresa, yeah. And like another, like for me, the most perfect example is the way we've told the story of Rosa Parks.
Yes.
And made her, history books have made her into a passive working woman who was just tired and wanted a seat on the bus, when in actual fact, she'd been working for the NAACP for a decade.
She wasn't the first person to sit down.
She wasn't the first person to do a bus boycott.
No.
And she was chosen intentionally with her own agency by the NAACP because of what she represented, and why she would work better than some of the other activists, and why a woman was significant. And all of that we take out of it. And so we've taken a lot of that agency from Antony and Stanton in this way that, Susan B. Anthony was incredibly smart and politically adept, and knew that for her side of the movement, and there were very many sides, but particularly that fell along the line of the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men the right to vote. And Stanton and Antony were very much opposed to the 15th Amendment. She knew they had to start telling a story in order to shift the perspective of the movement.
We should say they were not anti-abolition.
No.
They were anti-Black men getting rights before white women, before educated white women.
Educated white women, yes. Yeah.
So that may sound like a useless distinction, but it's not. Because it means, to me, it's an even more insidious form of racism, and it's the kind that lives in the North.
Yeah.
It's the like, I believe that you're a human being.
Yeah.
I would never enslave you, but I don't actually believe that we're the same class of human.
But I still have more rights to things than you do.
Because then we bring in the caste system that we have in America that we never talk about. So that's why I want to bring that up, because as somebody raised above the Mason-Dixon line, I was taught a very specific elitism about the way the North behaved in the 1800s that is false.
Yes, correct.
And this narrative plays into that falsehood.
Oh,
that
yeah.
There was that once you cross the Mason-Dixon line, it was the land of equality.
Right.
No, it was the land where slavery was illegal. Those are very different things.
Yeah. And so, obviously there's a lot of threads to pull with this concept of the politics of memory. And for me, what I think is and I spent a lot of time in Ireland thinking and working on commemoration, because there was a lot of 100-year anniversaries, significant 100-year historical anniversaries happening in Ireland when Dr. Kristen and I were living there. And I had a lot of friends and colleagues that worked dedicatedly on commemoration as a political construct. And so I think that's what's so interesting about this centenary that we're having right now, because, it can go one of two really ways when you're commemorating something. You can either whitewash it, heroicize it, put it up on a pedestal and say, oh, we can't critique this, it's too important, which is a lot of what happened in the UK or on the First World War. And then you have the camp that goes, no, but it's 100 years on and we should look at it for what it was. and we should make it complicated, and we should find the gray matter and the nuance in it. And you had a lot of that in the UK as well, specifically about the First World War, saying like, was this war necessary? Was this war a good thing? Like asking these questions that we never ask of things because we reify them once they've been.
Which means we turn them, for reify is our very giant word, which means we turn them into godheads. So we turn the ideas into religious entities that we worship. Yeah.
So the act of commemorating something every year, it becomes a ritual, and the more and more we practice that ritual, the less and less we question the event that it came from. And so it's interesting to me I haven't seen the camp yet for suffrage that's like, no, we shouldn't touch these women. I'm not sure it exists, which is fascinating.
No, I think that camp would just be the laziness of accepted history.
Possibly, yeah. And it could just be that like women's history isn't seen as significant enough, so there's just not as much attention on it. But I am loving this reevaluation of it and the perspective of this podcast, in that we have to examine and re-examine the way we tell stories and why we tell them the way we tell them is such a powerful thing to teach. I want to like blast email everyone who's teaching suffrage in the United States this year and be like, this podcast, make your students listen to this podcast. Because if we can get people younger, like if I had this podcast when I was 15, it would have changed my world. To be like, what? History, but history is facts. No.
And what's really fun too about thinking about putting it younger is that students don't think of abstract thoughts on their own. Developmentally, they can't. That doesn't really come till our early 20s, which is why there is such a massive difference between a freshman in college and a senior in college, not just in terms of fact, but in terms of abstract thought.
Yeah.
But when you introduce nuance to teenagers, they love it.
Yeah.
And it accelerates their mental development. They can hold nuance if we let them.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we teach them dichotomy, and then they settle into dichotomy. And we've robbed them of their ease of, so we get freshmen in college who are intransigent because when they were in high school, they were never taught about nuance. And so we owe them the complicated narrative. We owe them that America is weird and broken, and we owe this to them.
Yeah, and the other thing I think is so important that we need to start doing younger as well is to teach the difference between being critical and criticism.
Yes.
And that's another thing that I think comes through in this podcast is thinking critically. Like that's such a buzzword, right? Like, oh, you want to hire people with critical thinking skills. But I don't.
What does that mean?
But what does that mean? And I think, especially so much with the loss of nuance on social media, and the more like these younger kids in their teens, these Gen Z kids who have only ever known social media, where everything is either or, black or white, swipe left, swipe right, and everything is essentialized, then they only know criticism. And there's not a lot of room for critical thinking. And like we started out this whole discussion saying, like, we can hold several thoughts about Susan B. Anthony in tension. We can recognize what she did for women's rights in the United States while also recognizing that she was racist.
We can recognize that George Washington was an incredible first president and did a lot of really great things for our republic. And then he spent the rest of his life chasing down runaway slaves. Yeah.
Yeah. And recognizing that human beings are complicated is, it's kind of the underlying motivation for Abby research.
Yeah, it's kind of our life purpose.
Humans are complicated. Let us help you with this.
We love complication.
And so I think the more we can have these discussions in all these different formats, the better it is. And the earlier we can get humans to think this way, it's going to help everything. It's going to help all your relationships. It's certainly going to help you professionally. So for me, that's what gets me so jazzed. And obviously, if you guys are watching this still, you can tell how excited we are to talk about these ideas. But that's what gets me so like, excited about this podcast and the way it's reteaching us this history and these people, is because it's like, you know what, y'all, people are complicated. This was messy. It wasn't the way we were taught it. Let's have a chat about it. Yep.
No judgment, just saying no criticism, just critical thinking. And how do we go from that? So that's, believe it or not even a little bit all from us, but we're going to hit a bookmark here. Now we will continue to talk about this for the rest of the day.
Just remember, the 19th Amendment does not guarantee women the right to vote. There
is no constitutionally protected right to vote for anybody.
It's called states' rights. Well, yet another thing. I have learned so many things are states' rights. I understand now why we talk about it so much. But yeah, we could clearly go, a half an hour of a podcast had about 3 hours of content for the good doctors, but we'll stop where we are.
Gonna pause, and we will see you guys next episode.
Bye.